There was a place people were sent, not to be punished, not to be imprisoned, but to disappear. No trials, no release dates, no return journeys once you arrived. The world you knew ended quietly without witnesses, without records that mattered, and without anyone expecting you to survive. There were no escape stories passed down, no legends of men who broke free under cover of night, no elders who returned to warn the next generation, only absence. Welcome to Unrecorded. This is where history they tried to bury is brought back into the light. Stories erased, distorted, or silenced, examined carefully, and told honestly. If you're watching right now, let us know where you're watching from and the time in your location. Your presence matters here. We read your comments. We welcome your corrections, perspectives, and the histories you believe deserve attention. And if you believe the past should be confronted, not softened, join this community. Here, we don't just watch history, we recover it. Please stay with us till the end. Leave out distractions and pay attention. This is a story you don't want to miss. Let's begin. The people who spoke about this place did not describe it with maps or coordinates. They didn't talk about fences or buildings. They spoke of it the way humans speak of something final, something you don't tempt fate by naming too clearly. They called it the dead camp. It wasn't hidden deep in a jungle. It wasn't buried in the interior of a continent. It sat in plain sight, surrounded by water, wind, and the open sky. From a distance, it didn't look like a place of death at all. That was part of the design. Ships came and went. Flags flew. Orders were written. Officials filed reports. On paper, everything looked controlled, civilized, legal, but paper lies. Because the people sent there weren't meant to be counted as human beings, they were reduced to a problem, an inconvenience standing in the way of land, power, and profit. And problems, when framed that way, don't need mercy, they need solutions. This was one of those solutions. Long before the world learned the language of genocide, before the word itself had weight, systems were already being tested. Systems that asked a simple question: how do you erase a people without making noise? The answer was never chaos, it was organization. You isolate them, you exhaust them, you strip away identity, and then you let nature, hunger, and time finish what policy began. No gas chambers, no mass graves carved into memory, just a slow, deliberate breaking of the human body and spirit, so thorough that even history would struggle to reconstruct what happened. That is why this place barely appears in textbooks. That is why many people have never heard of it, and that is why the story matters. Because when history forgets a place where thousands vanished, it doesn't forget by accident. Forgetting is often the final stage of violence. The people sent to the dead camp were not criminals. They were not invaders. They were not rebels in the way empires like to define rebellion. They were men and women who refused to disappear quietly when their land was taken, their cattle seized, their labor demanded, and their humanity denied. Resistance does not always look like war. Sometimes it looks like refusal, and empires hate refusal more than open battle. So they created a destination with no future, a place where survival itself became an act of defiance, and defiance was not tolerated. The camp had no need for secrecy. The environment did the work. The isolation did the work. The rules did the work. And when people died, it wasn't treated as an event. It was treated as an outcome, expected, accepted, logged, if at all as a statistic. What makes the dead camp different from so many other atrocities is not just the scale of death, it's the certainty of it. People weren't sent there despite the likelihood they would die. They were sent there because they would. The camp functioned less like a prison and more like a filter, one that allowed almost nothing human to pass through. Families were broken apart. Names were replaced with numbers or roles. Bodies weakened under conditions that were never meant to sustain life. And when strength ran out, there was no intervention. No one was coming. The outside world did not protest. There were no emergency meetings, no moral reckoning at the time. This was not considered a scandal. It was considered policy. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Because when cruelty is wrapped in administration, it becomes invisible. It becomes boring. It becomes something future generations struggle to feel, even when the evidence is right in front of them. Especially when the victims were black, especially when the violence happened in a colony, far from European capitals, far from the people who would later rewrite history in their own image. Today, tourists can stand near this place and feel nothing unusual. The wind still blows, the sea still moves. Birds still pass overhead without noticing what once happened below. There are no screams left in the air, only silence, but silence doesn't mean peace. Silence means the story was interrupted. This film is not here to shock you. It's not here to overwhelm you with horror. It's here to do something far more dangerous. It's here to remember, to reconstruct a system that was designed to leave no survivors and no witnesses capable of testifying. It's here to ask why some tragedies become global symbols while others are reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. And it's here to confront a truth that still makes people uncomfortable. Some of the world's most efficient death camps were not hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers the way we imagine them today. Some of them were islands. Some of them were temporary solutions. Some of them existed before the world learned to be ashamed, before we name this place, before we explain who built it, before we count the dead. You need to understand one thing clearly. This was not a failure of humanity. It was an expression of it, under a system that decided certain lives were expendable. The dead camp was not an accident. It was a warning, and history ignored it. Before the dead camp existed, there was a decision, and before that decision, there was land. At the end of the 19th century, European empires were not just competing for territory. They were competing for speed. Whoever planted a flag first, wrote the first treaty, or claimed protection rights fastest could redraw entire regions on a map thousands of miles away. Germany was late to the race. Unlike Britain or France, Germany entered colonial expansion with something to prove: prestige, power, permanence. And in the southwest of Africa, what the Germans called German Southwest Africa. They believed they had found it. The land was vast, arid, but rich in grazing potential, perfect for cattle, perfect for settlers, and inconveniently already inhabited. For generations, the Herero and Nama peoples lived on this land. Their wealth was not measured in gold or currency, but in cattle, kinship, and control of territory passed down through memory, rather chibi than paperwork, to the German colonial administration. This way of life was not just unfamiliar, it was unacceptable. Because empires do not negotiate with people they do not recognize as equals, they formalize, they document, they extract. And when that fails, they enforce. Treaties were signed often under pressure, often misunderstood, often violated the moment they became inconvenient. Land was seized, water sources were claimed, cattle were confiscated as fines. Indigenous labor was demanded, then enforced, then normalized. Resistance was inevitable. By the early 1900s, tensions had hardened into something brittle and dangerous. The Herero, followed by the Nama, rose up against German rule, not to conquer, but to survive, to stop the slow suffocation of their communities. From the German perspective, this was not a political conflict, it was an insult. The response was swift and absolute. Berlin did not send negotiators. It sent soldiers, and not just any soldiers, but commanders who believed that mercy was weakness and extermination was efficiency. The most infamous of them issued an order that still chills historians today: the instruction that the Herero people were no longer German subjects and must be driven from the land or destroyed. This was not battlefield rage, this was policy. German forces pushed Herero men, women, and children into the desert. Wells were poisoned or guarded, escape routes were sealed. Survival itself was treated as defiance. thousands died of thirst and exhaustion before they ever saw a camp. But for those who survived the desert, a new system awaited them, one that required less ammunition and produced fewer visible bodies, a system of containment. The Germans did not call it extermination. They called it protective custody. They called it labor regulation. They called it security. Language matters, because language is how violence learns to wear a suit. Camps were established to collect survivors, people already broken by displacement and loss. These camps were not designed for rehabilitation or reintegration. They were designed to extract labor, suppress resistance, and ensure that what remained of these populations could never threaten colonial control again. Starvation rations, forced labor, exposure, disease. Death did not need to be ordered daily. It was built into the conditions. This is where the logic of the dead camp begins to form. Colonial administrators faced a problem: what to do with prisoners who were too weak to work, too visible to ignore, and too numerous to execute openly without drawing scrutiny. The solution was geography, isolation without secrecy, removal without disappearance, at least not immediately. An island off the coast, windswept, cold at night, surrounded by water that punished escape attempts, close enough to control, far enough to forget. It would not be presented as a place of death. It would be presented as a place of holding. But the people sent there understood the truth quickly. This was not where you waited to go home. This was where time slowed down and bodies failed. What made this system especially dangerous was not cruelty alone. It was bureaucracy. Records were kept, transfers were logged, labor outputs were measured, deaths were noted casually, if at all. Each piece of paper created distance between cause and consequence. No one clerk felt responsible for the outcome. No one officer felt like the executioner. And that is how mass death becomes administratively possible. By the time prisoners were being sent to the island that would earn the name Dead Camp, the German colonial project had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer about control. It was about erasure. Erase the capacity to resist. Erase the memory of autonomy. Erase the future. And when the work was done, erase the story. Because colonies were not meant to produce shame. They were meant to produce wealth and pride back home. What didn't fit that narrative was minimized, reframed, or buried. When Germany later lost this territory after World War I, the land changed hands, but the silence remained. No international tribunal came for what happened here. No global reckoning followed. No monuments rose immediately in the names of the dead. Instead, the story faded into archives, footnotes, and academic circles. While the descendants of the victims lived with the consequences in their bodies, their landlessness, and their interrupted histories, the dead camp was not an isolated horror. It was the logical endpoint of an empire that decided some lives were obstacles. And once that decision is made, everything that follows feels justified to those in power. In the next scene, we will go to the place itself, not yet with maps, not yet with numbers, but with the reasons it was chosen and why, once people were sent there, survival became the exception rather than the rule. From the mainland, it didn't look like much. A narrow stretch of rock and sand just off the coast near Letradiritz, surrounded by cold Atlantic water that never fully softened. No matter the season, the waves were not violent in a dramatic way. They were persistent, constant, the kind that wears things down slowly. This was Shark Island. To colonial administrators, it was ideal. It was close enough to supply, guard, and monitor, far enough to isolate completely. Escape required swimming through freezing water and unpredictable currents. Something even strong, healthy bodies struggled to survive. The prisoners sent here were neither strong nor healthy. The island had no natural shelter, no trees, no hills that blocked the wind. When the sun burned, it burned directly. When the cold came, it cut straight through bone. Day and night offered no real relief, only different kinds of exposure. This wasn't incidental. The environment was part of the system. Camps don't always need walls when nature can be turned into one. The people brought to the island arrived already exhausted. Many had survived forced marches, imprisonment elsewhere, hunger, and the loss of family members along the way. They stepped onto the island carrying the last fragments of endurance their bodies had left, and the island took the rest. Housing was minimal, often tents, sometimes nothing more than open ground. Clothing was inadequate, if provided at all. The wind coming off the ocean did not care about rank, age, or resistant history. It punished everyone equally. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. Bodies weakened by malnutrition cannot regulate heat. Hypothermia didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly while people slept or tried to. Food rations were never meant to sustain life. They were meant to delay death just long enough for labor to be extracted first. Hunger was constant, dull, and humiliating. People learned to measure days not by sunrise or sunset, but by how long it had been since they last ate something solid. Water, surrounded by the sea, was still scarce. Disease spread easily, not because of some mysterious outbreak, but because overcrowding, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems make illness inevitable. Medical care was minimal, inconsistent, and often conditional. Care was not the goal, control was. Forced labor continued even here. Prisoners were used to build infrastructure, carry heavy materials, and perform tasks that demanded strength their bodies no longer had. Work was enforced not because it was productive, but because it was disciplinary. Labor kept people too exhausted to organize, too broken to resist. Those who collapsed were not seen as victims. They were seen as inefficiencies. Death on the island was not sudden. It was cumulative. A little more hunger each day, a little more cold each night, a little more weakness until standing became optional and then impossible. Burials, when they happened, were shallow. Sometimes bodies were placed in the sand. Sometimes they were moved elsewhere. Documentation was inconsistent. Names were rarely preserved. A person could vanish here without leaving more than a line or nothing at all, and that was the point. Unlike later death camps that would rely on industrialized killing, this system depended on attrition. The island didn't need executions on a large scale. The conditions themselves did the work. This made the violence easier to deny. There were no dramatic moments for history to cling to, no single day of mass killing, no images that forced outrage at the time, just steady disappearance. To colonial authorities, the camp functioned exactly as intended. Resistance declined, numbers dwindled, control was maintained. The problem was being resolved without the inconvenience of constant warfare, and when deaths occurred, they could be blamed on illness, on climate, on weakness, on fate, never on policy. But survivors' testimonies, rare as they are, tell a different story. They describe a place where hope drained quickly, where people understood, often within days, that this was not a transit point. This was an end point. Parents watched children weaken. Children watched parents fade. Social structures collapsed under the pressure of survival. Dignity became difficult to hold on to when even standing upright required effort. And yet, even here, humanity did not vanish entirely. People shared scraps when they could. They remembered names. They whispered stories from before, about cattle, ceremonies, landscapes far from the sound of waves. These moments didn't save lives. They preserved something else, memory. That memory is what the system failed to fully erase. Because even though the camp was designed to eliminate witnesses, traces remained. In records that didn't quite align, in bones disturbed decades later, in oral histories passed down carefully, because speaking too openly once carried consequences. Today, standing on the island, it is difficult to see evidence of what happened. That absence is deceptive. Landscapes can be quiet without being innocent. Silence, in this case, is not proof that nothing happened. It is proof that what happened worked too well. The dead camp did not need to operate forever. It only needed to function long enough to achieve its purpose. When that purpose was complete, the system dissolved. The island returned to being just an island, but the damage did not dissolve with it. The descendants of those who were sent here inherited loss without graves, trauma without documentation, history without recognition. And for decades, the world moved on. In the next scene, we will look closer inside the routines, the rules, and the daily reality of the camp. Not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand how ordinary administration can produce extraordinary cruelty. Because what happened on this island was not chaos. It was ordered. Inside the dead camp, time did not move the way it did elsewhere. There were no clear beginnings or endings to the day, only cycles of exhaustion. Morning did not bring relief. Night did not bring rest. Each new day felt less like a continuation and more like a test to see who would fail next. The camp did not rely on constant violence to maintain control. It relied on routine. Routine is powerful. It teaches people what to expect. And when what you expect is suffering, your mind learns to narrow its focus to survival alone. Prisoners woke early, often before the sun had fully risen. Not because there was work to do immediately, but because hunger and cold made sleep impossible. The body, deprived of food and warmth, refuses to stay still. There was no proper roll call in the way modern prisons imagine it. Counting happened inconsistently. Names were rarely used. People were identified by their usefulness, who could still walk, could still carry, who could still obey. Those who could work were separated from those who could not. This division was not temporary. It was a verdict. Labor inside the camp was not organized for efficiency. It was organized for submission. Prisoners carried stones, moved supplies, built and rebuilt structures exposed to wind and salt. Tasks was word, repetitive, physically demanding, and deliberately pointless at times. The goal was not construction. The goal was depletion. Guards did not need to shout constantly. The system itself enforced obedience. A missed task could mean reduced rations. Reduced rations meant faster collapse. Everyone understood the equation. Food was issued sparingly and irregularly. Rations were small, often nutritionally empty, and insufficient for people expected to perform heavy labor. Hunger became a permanent condition, not a temporary discomfort. People learned to slow their movements to conserve energy. They learned to sit when possible. They learned that standing too long without reason could cost them the strength needed later. Hunger reshaped social behavior. Conversations became shorter. Arguments became rare, not because people were peaceful, but because conflict required energy no one could spare. Water distribution followed similar logic. Scarcity created dependency. Dependency reinforced control. Even surrounded by the ocean, thirst remained a daily threat. Disease moved quietly through the camp. There was nothing dramatic about it, no sudden outbreaks that drew attention. Just steady illness spreading among bodies already weakened by malnutrition. and well, exposure. Medical care existed, in theory, more than practice. Treatment was inconsistent. Some were ignored, some were examined briefly and returned to labor. Survival often depended less on diagnosis and more on whether someone was still considered useful. Children were not spared. They were present in the camp, witnessing suffering long before they could understand it. Childhood collapsed early here. Fear became normal, loss became familiar. Many children did not live long enough to remember anything else. Families were not kept intact. Separation happened casually during labor assignments, transfers, or death. The system did not need to actively destroy family bonds. The conditions did it naturally. Death did not interrupt the routine. When someone collapsed during work, the response was often delayed. Sometimes there was none at all. Bodies were removed quietly. Others continued working nearby. Stopping to mourn was not permitted, and over time people stopped expecting the chance. Burials were minimal. Sometimes bodies were placed in shallow ground. Sometimes they were moved elsewhere. Sometimes the record of a person's existence ended without ceremony or documentation. A person could be alive one day and effectively erased the next. This constant proximity to death changed perception. People stopped asking if someone would die. The only question was when. Yet even within this environment, the camp never fully achieved what it set out to do. Human beings adapted. Prisoners formed quiet networks. They shared information who was watching. When guards changed where scraps might be found, they shared food when they could. Even knowing it might shorten their own survival, memory became resistance. People whispered names so they would not vanish completely. They recalled villages, cattle paths, family lineages. These stories were not told to escape reality. They were told to preserve identity. In a system designed to strip it away, the guards rarely noticed these small acts. They focused on visible compliance, on order, on numbers. From their perspective, the camp was functioning. Mortality was high, but explainable. Labor was ongoing. Resistance had been crushed. The problem population was shrinking. That is how the dead camp avoided scrutiny. Nothing here looked chaotic enough to demand intervention. Nothing appeared urgent enough to provoke outrage elsewhere. The suffering was slow, systematic, and easy to rationalize. And because the victims were black, colonized, and distant from European centers of power, their suffering did not disrupt the narrative of progress and civilization. By the time the camp began to wind down, thousands had passed through it. Very few survived. Those who did carried physical and psychological scars that followed them for life. The system did not collapse because it was exposed. It ended because it had achieved its purpose. The camp was never meant to last forever. It was meant to remove a generation's capacity to resist. And once that capacity was broken, the machinery could be dismantled quietly. But dismantling a camp does not undo its consequences. What happened inside the dead camp reshaped entire communities. It disrupted lineages, it severed cultural transmission. It left gaps that could not be filled by later generations. And because the world did not immediately name what happened here for what it was, the damage lingered without acknowledgement. In the next scene, we will confront the numbers, not to reduce lives to statistics, but to understand the scale of disappearance, the gaps in the records, and why counting the dead remains contested, even today. Because when death is bureaucratic, even memory becomes a B-side battle. At some point, every story of mass death reaches the same uncomfortable question. How many? It sounds simple. It never is. When historians try to count the dead from the dead camp, they are not just dealing with missing paperwork or damaged archives. They are confronting a system that was never designed to remember its victims in the first place. Numbers were not kept to honor lives. They were kept to manage a process, and even then, they were incomplete. The camp operated in a colonial world where African lives were rarely recorded with precision. Names were misspelled, shortened, or omitted entirely. Ages were guessed. Causes of death were generalized. Entire categories of children, the elderly, the already sick often disappeared from the record without explanation. Death certificates, when they existed, were vague: exhaustion, disease, natural causes. Words that obscure more than they reveal. What is known is this: mortality at the camp was extreme. Contemporary observers, later researchers, and descendant communities all agree on that much. People did not pass through this place and return in meaningful numbers. Survival was rare enough to become remarkable, but when scholars attempt to attach numbers to that reality, estimates begin to vary. Some records suggest deaths in the thousands. Others imply much higher figures when camp deaths are combined with those who died before arrival, during forced marches, imprisonment elsewhere, or displacement. And this is where the story becomes contested. Colonial archives often underreport deaths, not always out of deliberate malice, but because death itself had become routine. When something is expected, it stops being documented carefully. There was no incentive to be precise. From the perspective of colonial administrators, high mortality was not evidence of failure. It was evidence that the system was working. So deaths were noted casually, aggregated monthly, or ignored entirely if the body never entered a formal registry. Many who died were never officially in the camp to begin with. They arrived sick. They collapsed shortly after. They were disposed of quickly. And when a person is never fully counted as alive, their death becomes mathematically invisible. This is why historians speak cautiously. You will hear phrases like "at least," "estimated," and "likely." These words are not hedging. They are acknowledgments of uncertainty produced by design. Counting the dead here is not a matter of arithmetic. It is an act of reconstruction. Researchers cross-reference shipping logs, supply requests, labor outputs, and correspondence. They examine sudden drops in prisoner numbers that are not explained by transfers. They compare population data from before and after the genocide. They listen to oral histories passed down by descendants, stories that do not align neatly with the written record, but carry truths of their own. And slowly a picture emerges. Not a precise figure, but a pattern. People entered the system in large numbers. People left it in very small ones. The dead camp functioned less like a revolving door and more like a narrowing funnel. Every stage reduced the number of survivors. By the time the camp closed, entire family lines had ended. Cultural knowledge that depended on elders vanished with them. Names that should have been spoken for generations stopped being spoken at all. This loss cannot be captured fully by numbers, but numbers still matter. Because numbers challenge denial, they resist minimization. They force confrontation. And denial has always hovered close to this story. For decades, colonial violence in Africa was described as harsh but necessary, as tragic but exaggerated, as unfortunate side effects of progress. Precise numbers disrupt that narrative. They turn abstraction into scale. They make it harder to dismiss what happened as isolated incidents or unintended consequences. This is why debates over death tolls can become emotionally charged, not because historians enjoy arguing, but because acknowledgement carries weight. To accept a high number is to accept responsibility, and responsibility was never something colonial powers rushed to claim. In the absence of complete records, some voices have tried to downplay the camp's significance. They point to uncertainty as doubt. They treat gaps as excuses rather than evidence of erasure. But uncertainty cuts both ways. When records are incomplete, the true number is rarely lower than what is documented. It is almost always higher. This is especially true in systems where the dead were not considered worth counting. The dead camp did not just kill people, it disrupted the ability to remember them accurately. It fragmented the trail historians now struggle to follow. That fragmentation is part of the violence. Even today, descendants searching for ancestors encounter silence. Names that should exist do not. Graves are unmarked or disturbed. Remains are displaced or unidentified. Loss continues long after death, and this raises a deeper question, one that cannot be answered by numbers alone. Why did it take so long for the world to call this what it was? Why did recognition arrive decades late, if at all? Why did other atrocities become central to global memory, while this one remained marginal? These questions are not about comparison, they are about visibility. History does not remember everything equally. It remembers what power allows it to remember, and in the case of the dead camp, forgetting was convenient. In the next scene, we will move forward in time to what happened after the camp closed, to the silence that followed, to how a site of mass death faded into obscurity, and why that disappearance from public memory may be one of the most enduring consequences of all. Because sometimes the final act of violence is not killing, it is being forgotten. When the dead camp closed, there was no announcement, no declaration that something terrible had ended, no acknowledgement that lives had been destroyed on an industrial scale. The machinery simply slowed, then stopped as if the work had been completed and the tools were no longer needed. And in a sense it had. The camp was never meant to be permanent. It existed for a purpose, and once that purpose was fulfilled, there was no reason to preserve it, no reason to explain it, no reason to remember it. So the system did what systems often do when confronted with their own brutality. It moved on. The land changed hands, administration shifted, records were archived, scattered, or quietly ignored. New priorities replaced old ones, and the island, saturated with suffering, returned to the background of everyday life. Silence settled in. This silence was not enforced with censorship or threats. It did not need to be. Silence thrives when there is no audience demanding answers. The survivors, few as they were, returned to communities already shattered. They carried memories that were difficult to explain and dangerous to dwell on. In a world where colonial authorities still shaped reality, speaking openly about what had happened offered no protection, no justice, and no relief. So many did what people often do when trauma is unsupported. They endured quietly. Stories were shared within families, if at all. Details softened over time, not because they were unimportant, but because remembering too sharply made survival harder. Pain was passed down indirectly in habits, in fear, in loss of land and opportunity. What was not passed down was recognition. There were no trials for what happened at the dead camp. No public reckoning that forced the colonial powers involved to confront the scale of their actions. When global attention later turned to mass violence elsewhere, this story remained peripheral. Not because it was smaller, but because it did not fit the narrative the world was ready to tell. In the decades that followed, history books framed colonialism as complex, regrettable, but ultimately civilizing. Violence was portrayed as excess rather than intention. Camps were described as unfortunate necessities rather than deliberate tools of destruction. The dead camp did not align with that framing, so it slipped through the cracks. Even the word camp softened its reality. It sounded temporary, administrative, almost benign. Nothing in the language conveyed the certainty of death, the absence of survival, or the deliberate nature of the system. As time passed, physical traces faded, structures collapsed or were dismantled. The environment reclaimed the space. Wind and salt erased visible scars more efficiently than any official cleanup ever could. Visitors could stand there and feel nothing unusual. And when a place feels ordinary, it becomes easy to believe nothing extraordinary happened there. This is how forgetting becomes normalized, not through denial alone, but through neglect. By the mid-20th century, the world had new horrors to process, new wars, new camps, new images that forced themselves into global consciousness. Compared to these, the dead camp seemed distant, earlier less urgent. Its victims did not have a powerful state advocating for their memory. They did not have extensive archives preserved for future generations. They did not have immediate international recognition. What they had was absence. And absence is difficult to argue with. Even when scholars began revisiting colonial violence, the focus often remained narrow. The genocide itself was discussed, but the camp, its role, its function, its certainty of death remained under-examined. Outside academic circles, public memory lagged behind historical evidence. This gap matters, because when societies forget how violence was organized in the past, they struggle to recognize its early forms in the present. The dead camp was not a chaotic outburst of cruelty. It was structured, documented, rationalized. That makes it dangerous, not because it was unique, but because it was repeatable. The silence surrounding the camp did not happen by chance. It was reinforced by power, by whose suffering was deemed worthy of attention, by whose deaths were considered foundational rather than tragic. The camp's victims were black, colonized, and already marginalized. Their loss did not disrupt global systems of empathy, so history learned to live without their story. Only much later, through persistent research, advocacy by descendant communities, and shifting global conversations about colonial accountability, did the dead camp begin to re-enter public awareness. Not loudly, cautiously, fragments emerged, reports, investigations, academic studies, debates over terminology, disputes over land use and memorialization. Each of these moments challenged the silence, but none fully broke it. Because breaking silence requires more than evidence. It requires willingness, and willingness often arrives late. Even today, recognition remains incomplete. Memorials are debated, remains are contested, apologies are issued with limitations. Responsibility is acknowledged carefully, hedged with language that minimizes liability. Justice, when delayed this long, rarely feels like justice, but remembrance still matters, not as closure. Closure is a luxury many descendants do not have. Remembrance matters because it interrupts the final stage of violence, the erasure of meaning. To remember the dead camp is to insist that systems of extermination did not begin suddenly in the 20th century. They evolved, they were tested, they were refined, and they were ignored when the victims were easy to ignore. In the next scene, we will confront that uncomfortable continuity. The question of whether what happened here was an isolated colonial crime or part of a longer lineage of organized destruction that the world failed to stop when it had the chance. Because history does not repeat itself blindly, it repeats itself when warnings are dismissed. History often pretends that its worst moments appear suddenly, as if violence arrives fully formed, as if systems of mass death emerge overnight without rehearsal, without precedent, without smaller experiments that test what the world will tolerate. That is not how history works. What happened at the dead camp did not exist in isolation. It was not a historical anomaly confined to a remote island at the edge of an empire. It was part of a longer process, one that revealed how modern systems learn to destroy human beings efficiently, not through rage, through procedure. The camp demonstrated something dangerous, that mass death could be achieved without spectacle, without chaos, without widespread protest, if it was wrapped in administration and directed at people already deemed disposable. This realization did not vanish when the camp closed. Ideas travel, even when people do not. Colonial administrators rotated through different territories. Military officers carried experience with them. Bureaucrats refined language. Methods were discussed, adapted, improved, not because there was a single master plan, but because systems learn from what works. The dead camp showed that isolation could replace overt violence, that attrition could be more effective than execution, that nature itself could be weaponized, allowing authorities to deny intent while achieving the same outcome. These lessons did not remain confined to colonial spaces forever. They resurfaced later in different forms under different regimes, targeting different populations, but following familiar logic. That connection makes people uncomfortable, not because it diminishes later atrocities, but because it expands responsibility backward in time. It suggests that the world had opportunities to recognize warning signs and failed to act on them. The dead camp was one such warning. It showed what happens when a state decides that an entire group is a problem to be solved, rather than a population to be protected. It showed how language can transform extermination into administration. It showed how moral distance makes cruelty easier to justify. And it showed how quickly the world can look away. There is a temptation to draw straight lines between this camp and later, more infamous ones. Some historians argue that colonial practices influenced later systems directly. Others caution against oversimplification, pointing out differences in ideology, scale, and technology. Both perspectives matter. What matters more is the pattern. The pattern is not about copying blueprints. It is about normalization. Once a system demonstrates that certain lives can be eliminated quietly, efficiently, and with minimal consequences, that idea does not disappear. It lingers. It waits for new conditions, new justifications, new targets. Colonial spaces were often where such ideas were tested first, because violence there carried fewer political costs. The victims were distant. Their suffering did not disrupt the moral self-image of the empires involved. This is why colonial violence is not just a historical footnote. It is foundational. It shaped how power learned to operate without accountability. The dead camp also reveals something else, something more unsettling. The world did not fail to act because it lacked information. Reports existed, witnesses existed. Death was visible to those who wanted to see it. The failure was not ignorance, it was indifference. Indifference rooted in hierarchy, in race, in the belief that some lives mattered less, and therefore their loss mattered less too. That belief did not end with colonialism, it mutated. And when later atrocities occurred, the world responded with shock, as if it had never seen such systems before. As if the logic of elimination had appeared from nowhere. But the dead camp tells a different story. It tells us that modern mass violence did not emerge fully formed in the 20th century. It evolved. It was refined. It was ignored when it targeted the colonized. This does not mean history was destined to repeat itself. Destiny is an excuse. It means choices were made and unmade. Opportunities to confront violence early were missed. Warnings were dismissed because acknowledging them would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about empire, progress, and moral responsibility. The dead camp is one of those truths. It forces a question that still resonates today. If a system can destroy thousands quietly, legally, and with little resistance, what stops it from doing so again under different circumstances? The answer is not memory alone. Memory is fragile. It fades, it competes with newer crises. What stops repetition is accountability, and accountability requires recognition, not just of what happened, but of why it was allowed to happen. The dead camp was allowed to exist because it fit into a worldview that ranked human value, because it served economic and political goals, because its victims were denied the protections extended to others. These conditions are not relics of the past. They persist in different forms, in different places, under different names. This is why the story matters beyond its historical moment, not because it offers easy parallels, but because it exposes a recurring logic of power, a logic that says isolate, exhaust, erase, and then forget. In the final scene, we will return to the present, to the island today, to the debates over memory and remains, to the question of what justice looks like when the crime is more than a century old. But the consequences are still alive, because remembering the dead camp is not about reopening old wounds. It is about refusing to let silence finish the work. Today, the island is quiet. The wind still moves the same way it did more than a century ago. The ocean still surrounds the land with cold indifference. From a distance, there is nothing to suggest that this place once functioned as a machine designed to erase human beings. This is Shark Island as it exists now, a place people can visit, a place people can pass through, a place that does not announce its past. That silence is unsettling, not because it hides violence, but because it normalizes forgetting. For descendants of those who are sent here, the island is not abstract, it is not symbolic, it is personal. It represents ancestors who never returned, names that disappeared from family lines, and histories interrupted so completely that reconstruction becomes an act of imagination as much as research. What remains is not just land, what remains is absence. For decades, there was little public acknowledgement of what this place had been. No prominent memorial, no widely taught history, no shared language to describe what happened here without minimizing it. When recognition did begin to surface, it came slowly and often defensively. Discussions focused on terminology, on whether the word genocide was appropriate, on how responsibility should be framed, on what could be acknowledged without implying legal or moral obligation. These debates mattered, but they also delayed something more important. Listening, because long before governments argued over language, communities already knew what had happened. They carried that knowledge quietly, without validation, without apology, without closure. Memory survived where official recognition did not. Even today, remembrance is uneven. Some accounts are preserved in academic journals and museums. Others exist only in oral histories, fragile and vulnerable to disappearance. As elders pass on, the landscape itself offers little help. Physical traces were never meant to last. Camps like this one were designed to be temporary, to leave no permanent markers that could later demand explanation. This makes remembrance a choice, not a default. You have to decide to see what is no longer visible. And that decision carries weight, because when societies choose not to remember places like the dead camp, they don't just erase victims from the past. They weaken their ability to recognize similar systems in the present. The conditions that allowed this camp to exist were not extraordinary. They were familiar, a belief that some lives were expendable, a system that prioritized control over humanity, a distance geographic and moral that made suffering easier to ignore. These forces have not disappeared. They have changed form. They appear in policies that treat people as numbers, in systems that normalize deprivation as management, in spaces where isolation is used to silence, exhaust, and erase. The dead camp is not important because it was the worst. It is important because it was early. It shows how modern violence learns to operate quietly, how it hides behind procedure, how it relies on indifference more than hatred, and how easily it fades from memory when the victims are not powerful enough to demand remembrance. Telling this story now is not about assigning inherited guilt or reopening historical wounds for spectacle. It is about restoring continuity, placing this camp back into the timeline it was removed from. It is about refusing to treat colonial violence as a preface that does not count, because history does not begin where we are most comfortable looking. It begins where the harm started. When we name the dead camp, when we speak its history clearly, we interrupt the final phase of the system that created it. Erasure, we restore specificity where vagueness once protected power. We replace silence with record. We acknowledge that the foundations of the modern world include places like this, whether or not we were taught to see them. And in doing so, we offer something the camp was designed to prevent: witness. Not the kind that sensationalizes suffering, but the kind that insists on accuracy, on context, on memory, that does not flinch, because the people who were sent here did not disappear because they were forgotten. They were forgotten because they were made to disappear. Remembering them does not undo what happened, but it changes what happens next. It ensures that when systems begin to isolate, dehumanize, and erase again, as they inevitably try to, there are voices ready to say, "We have seen this before, and we know where it leads." The dead camp was meant to leave no survivors and no story. This video is proof that it failed.